washed some of the hay into the river. But this morning the sun shone out all the more brilliantly for the deluge, and the air was balmy and clear. The crooked lane leading from their own parish to Mellstock ran along the lowest levels in a portion of its length, and when the girls reached the most depressed spot, they found that the result of the rain had been to flood the lane over shoe to a distance of some 50 yards. This would have been no serious hindrance on a weekday. They would have clicked through it in their high pattens and boots quite unconcerned. But on this day of vanity, this sun's day, when flesh went forth to coquette with flesh, while hypocritically affecting business with spiritual things. On this occasion, for wearing their white stockings and thin shoes, and their pink, white and buff gowns, on which every mud spot would be visible, the pool was an awkward impediment. They could hear the church bell calling, as yet nearly a mile off. Who would have expected such a rise in the river in summertime? Said Marianne, from the top of the roadside bank, on which they had climbed, and were maintaining a precarious footing in the hope of creeping along its slope, so they were past the pool. We can't get there anyhow, without walking right through it, or else going round Stonebridge Way, and that would make us so very late, said Retty, pausing hopelessly. And I do colour up so hot, walking into church late, and all the people staring round, said Marianne, that I hardly cool down again till we get into the that it may please these. While they stood clinging to the bank, they heard a splashing round the bend of the road, and presently appeared Angel Clare, advancing along the lane towards them through the water. 4 hearts gave a big throb simultaneously. His aspect was probably as unsabbatarian a one as a dogmatic parson's son often presented, his attire being his dairy clothes, long wading boots, a cabbage leaf inside his hat to keep his head cool, and a thistle spud to finish him off. He's not going to church, said Marianne. No, I wish he was, murmured Tess. Angel, in fact, rightly or wrongly, to adopt the safe phrase of evasive controversialities, preferred sermons in stones to sermons in churches and chapels on fine summer days. This morning, moreover, he had gone out to see if the damage to the hay by the flood was considerable or not. On his walk, he observed the girls from a long distance, though they had been so occupied with their difficulties of passage as not to notice him. He knew that the water had risen at that spot, and that it would quite check their progress. So he had hastened on with a dim idea of how he could help them, one of them in particular. The rosy-cheeked, bright-eyed quartet looked so charming in their light summer attire, clinging to the roadside bank, like pigeons on a roof slope, that he stopped a moment to regard them before coming close. Their gauzy skirts had brushed up from the grass innumerable flies and butterflies which, unable to escape, remained caged in the transparent tissue as in an aviary. Angel's eye at last fell upon Tess, the hindmost of the 4. She, being full of suppressed laughter at their dilemma, could not help meeting his glance radiantly. He came beneath them in the water, which did not rise over his long boots, and stood looking at the entrapped flies and butterflies. "Are you trying to get to church?" he said to Marianne, who was in front, including the next 2 in his remark, but avoiding Tess. "Yes, sir, and it's getting late, and my colour do come up so." "I'll carry you through stand still. Nonsense. You are not too heavy, and carry you all four together. Now, Marianne, attend, he continued, and put your arms round my shoulders, so. Now, hold on. That's well done. Marianne had lowered herself upon his arm and shoulder as directed, and Angel strode off with her, his slim figure, as viewed from behind, looking like the mere stem to the great nosegay suggested by hers. They disappeared round the curve of the road, and only his Susing's footsteps in the top ribbon of Marianne's bonnet told where they were. In a few minutes he reappeared. Is Hewitt was the next in order upon the bank. Here he comes, she murmured, and he could hear that her lips were dry with emotion. And I have to put my arms round his neck and look into his face as Marianne did. There's nothing in that, said Tess quickly. There's a time for everything, continued Is, unheeding. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. The first is now going to be mine. Fee, it is scripture, Is. Yes, said Is. I've always had ear at church for pretty verses. Angel Clare, to whom the 3/4 of this performance was a commonplace act of kindness, now approached Is. She quietly and dreamily lowered herself into his arms, and Angel methodically marched off with her. When he was heard returning for the 3rd time, Reddy's throbbing heart could be almost seen to shake her. He went up to the red-haired girl, and, while he was seizing her, he glanced at Tess. His lips could not have pronounced more plainly. It will soon be you and I. Her comprehension appeared in her face. She could not help it. There was an understanding between them. Poor little Reddy, though by far the lightest weight, was the most troublesome of Clare's burdens. Marianne had been like a sack of meal, a dead weight of plumpness, under which he had literally staggered. Is had ridden sensibly and calmly. Reddy was a bunch of hysterics. However, he got through with the disquieted creature, deposited her, and returned. Tess could see over the hedge the distant 3 in a group, standing as he had placed them on the next rising ground. It was now her turn. She was embarrassed to discover that excitement at the proximity of Mr. Clare's breath and eyes, which she had contemned in her companions, was intensified in herself, and, as if fearful of betraying her secret, she paltered with him at the last moment. I may be able to climb along the bank, perhaps. I can climb better than they. You must be so tired, Mr. Clare. No, Tess, said he quickly, and almost before she was aware, she was seated in his arms and resting against his shoulder. 3 Leahs to get 1 Rachel, he whispered. They are better women than I, she replied, magnanimously sticking to her resolve. Not to me, said Angel. He saw her grow warm at this, and they went some steps in silence. I hope I am not too heavy, she said timidly. Oh no, you should lift Marianne. Such a lump. You are like an undulating billow, warmed by the sun, and all this fluff of muslin about you is the froth. It is very pretty, if I seem like that to you. Do you know that I have undergone 3/4 of this labour entirely for the sake of the 4th quarter? No, I did not expect such an event today. Nor I. The water came up so sudden. That the rise in the water was what she understood him to refer to, the state of her breathing bellied. Clare stood still and inclined his face towards hers. Oh, Tessie, he exclaimed. The girl's cheeks burned to the breeze, and she But at last they came to the bend, and the rest of their progress was in full view of the other three. The dry land was reached, and he set her down. Her friends were looking with round, thoughtful eyes at her and him, and she could see that they had been talking of her. He hastily bade them farewell and splashed back along the stretch of submerged road. The four moved on together as before, till Marianne broke the silence by saying, "No, in all truth, we have no chance against her." She looked joyously at Tess. "What do you mean?" asked the latter. "He likes E best, the very best. We could see it as he brought E. He would have kissed E if you had encouraged him to do it, ever so little." "No, no," said she. The gaiety with which they had set out had somehow vanished, and yet there was no enmity or malice between them. They were generous young souls that had been reared in the lonely country nooks where fatalism is a strong sentiment, and they did not blame her. Such supplanting was to be. Tess's heart ached. There was no concealing from herself the fact that she loved Angel Clare. Perhaps all the more passionately from knowing that the others had also lost their hearts to him. There is contagion in this sentiment, especially among women, and yet that same hungry heart of hers compassionated her friends. Tess's honest nature had fought against this, but too feebly, and the natural result had followed. "I will never stand in your way, nor in the way of either of ye," she declared to Reddy that night in the bedroom, her tears running down. "I can't help this, my dear. I don't think marrying is in his mind at all. But if he were even to ask me, I should refuse him, as I should refuse any man." "Oh, would you? Why?" said wondering Loretta. "It cannot be. But I will be plain. Putting myself quite on one side, I don't think he will choose either of you. I have never expected it, thought of it," moaned Reddy. "But oh, I wish I was dead." The poor child, torn by a feeling which she hardly understood, turned to the two other girls, who came upstairs just then. "We be friends with her again," she said to them. "She thinks no more of his choosing her than we do." So the reserve went off, and they were confiding and warm. "I don't seem to care what I do now," said Marianne, whose mood was turned to its lowest base. "I was going to marry a dirty man at Stickleford, who's asked me twice, but, my soul, I would put an end to myself rather than be his wife now. Why don't ye speak, Liz?" "To confess then," said Iz, "I made sure today that he was going to kiss me as he held me, and I stayed still against his breast, hoping, and never moved at all. But he did not. I don't like biding here at Talbothy's any longer. I shall go home." The air of the sleeping chamber seemed to palpitate with the hopeless passion of the girls. They writhed feverishly under the oppressiveness of an emotion thrust on them by cruel nature's law, an emotion which they had neither expected nor desired. The instant of the day had fanned the flame that was burning the inside of their hearts out, and the torture was almost more than they could endure. The differences which distinguished them as individuals were abstracted by this passion, and each was but portion of one organism called sex. There was little jealousy because there was no hope. Each one was a girl of fair common sense, and she did not delude herself with any vain conceits, or dress herself downstairs. "Be you awake, Tess?" whispered one, half an hour later. It was Hewitt's voice. Tess replied in the affirmative, whereupon also Retty and Marianne suddenly flung the bedclothes off them and sighed. "So be we. I wonder what she is like, the lady they say his family have looked out for him." "I wonder," said Is. "Some lady looked out for him," gasped Tess, starting. "I've never heard of that." "Oh yes, 'tis whispered, a young lady of his own rank, chosen by his family, a doctor of divinity's daughter, near his father's parish, of a minister. He don't much care for her, they say, but he is sure to marry her." They had heard so very little of this, yet it was enough to build up wretched Dolores' dreams upon there in the shade of the night. They pictured all the details of his being won round to consent, of the wedding preparations, of the bride's happiness, of her dress and veil, of her blissful home with him, when oblivion would have fallen upon themselves, as far as he and their love were concerned. Thus they talked, and ached, and wept, till sleep charmed their sorrows away. After this disclosure, Tess nourished no further foolish thought that there lurked any grave and deliberate import in Claire's attentions to her. It was a passing summer love of her face, for love's own temporary sake, nothing more. And the thorny crown of this sad conception was that she, whom he really did prefer in a cursory way to the rest, she who knew herself to be more impassioned in nature, cleverer, more beautiful than they, was, in the eyes of propriety, far less worthy of him than the homelier ones whom he ignored. Chapter 24. Amid the oozing fatness and warm ferments of the Var Vale, at a season when the rush of juices could almost be heard below the hiss of fertilization, it was impossible that the most fanciful love should not grow passionate. The ready bosoms existing there were impregnated by their surroundings. July passed over their heads, and the Thermidorian weather, which came in its wake, seemed an effort on the part of nature to match the state of hearts at Talbot's dairy. The air of the place, so fresh in the spring and early summer, was stagnant and enervating now. Its heavy scents weighed upon them, and at midday the landscape seemed lying in a swoon. Ethiopic scorchings browned the upper slopes of the pastures, but there was still bright green herbage here, where the watercourses purled, and as Claire was oppressed by the outward heats, so was he burdened inwardly by a waxing fervour of passion with the soft and silent Tess. The rains, having passed the uplands, were dry. The wheels of the dairyman's spring cart, as he sped home from market, licked up the pulverized surface of the highway, and were followed by white ribbons of dust, as if they set a thin powder train on fire. The cows jumped wildly over the 5-barred Barton gate, maddened by the gadfly. Dairyman Craig kept his shirt sleeves permanently rolled up past his elbows. Open windows produced no effect in ventilation without open doors, and in the dairy garden the blackbirds and thrushes crept about under the currant bushes, rather in the manner of quadrupeds than of winged creatures. The flies in the kitchen were lazy, teasing, and familiar, crawling about in unwonted places, on the floor, into drawers, and over the backs of the milkmaids' hands. Conversations were concerning sunstroke, while butter making, and still more butter keeping, was a despair. They milked entirely in the meads for During the day, the animals obsequiously followed the shadow of the smallest tree as it moved round the stem, with the diurnal roll, and when the milkers came, they could hardly stand still for the flies. On one of these afternoons, 4 or 5 unmilked cows chanced to stand apart from the general herd, behind the corner of a hedge, among them being Tumbling and Old Pretty, who loved Tess's hands above those of any other maid. When she rose from her stool under a finished cow, Angel Clare, who had been observing her for some time, asked her if she would take the aforesaid creatures next. She silently assented, and, with her stool at arm's length, and the pail against her knee, went round to where they stood. Soon the sound of Old Pretty's milk fizzing into the pail came through the hedge, and then Angel felt inclined to go round the corner also, to finish off a hard-yielding milcher who had strayed there, he being now as capable of this as any, as the dairyman himself. All the men, and some of the women, when milking, dug their foreheads into the cows and gazed into the pail, but a few, mainly the younger ones, rested their heads sideways. This was Tess Turberfield's habit, her temple pressing the milcher's flank, her eyes fixed on the far end of the meadow, with the gaze of one lost in meditation. She was milking Old Pretty thus, and the sun chancing to be on the milking side, it shone flat upon her pink gowned form, and her white curtain bonnet, and upon her profile, rendering it dazzlingly keen as a cameo cut from the dun background of the cow. She did not know that Clare had followed her round, and that he sat under his cow, watching her. The absolute stillness of her head and features was remarkable. She might have been in a trance, her eyes open, yet unseeing. Nothing in the picture moved but Old Pretty's tail and Tess's pink hands, the latter so gently as to be a rhythmic pulsation only, as if they were obeying a reflex stimulus, like a beating heart. How very lovable her face was to him, yet there was nothing ethereal about it. All was real vitality, real warmth, real incarnation, and it was in her mouth that this culminated. Eyes almost as deep and speaking he had seen before, and cheeks perhaps as fair, brows as arched, a chin and throat almost as shapely. Her mouth he had seen nothing to equal on the face of the earth. To a young man with the least fire in him, that little upward lift in the middle of her red top lip was distracting, infatuating, maddening. He had never before seen a woman's lips and teeth which formed upon his mind but such persistent iteration, the old Elizabethan smile of roses filled with snow. Perfect he, as a lover, might have called them offhand. But no, they were not perfect, and it was the touch of the imperfect upon the would-be perfect that gave the sweetness, because it was that which gave the humanity. Clare had studied the curves of those lips so many times that he could reproduce them mentally with ease, and now, as they again confronted him, clothed with colour and life, they sent an aura over his flesh, a cold breeze through his nerves, which well nigh produced a qualm, and actually produced, by some mysterious physiological process, a prosaic sneeze. She then became conscious that he was observing her, but she would not show it by any change of position, though the curious dreamlike fixity disappeared, and a close eye might easily have discerned her that the rosiness resolutions, reticences, prudences, fears fell back like a defeated battalion. He jumped up from his seat and, leaving his pail to be kicked over if the milcher had such a mind, went quickly towards the desire of his eye, and kneeling down beside her, clasped her in his arms. Tess was taken completely by surprise, and she yielded to his embrace with unreflecting inevitableness. Having seen that it was really her lover who had advanced and no one else, her lips parted, and she sank upon him in her momentary joy, with something very like an ecstatic cry. He had been on the point of kissing that too tempting mouth, but he checked himself for tender conscience' sake. "Forgive me, Tess dear," he whispered. "I ought to have asked. I did not know what I was doing. I do not mean it as a liberty. I am devoted to you, Tessie, dearest, in all sincerity." Old Pretty, by this time, had looked round, puzzled, and, seeing two people crouching under her, where, by immeasurable custom, there should have been only one, lifted her hind leg crossly. "She is angry. She doesn't know what we mean. She'll kick over the milk," exclaimed Tess, gently striving to free herself, her eyes concerned with the quadruped's actions, her heart more deeply concerned with herself and Claire. She slipped up from her seat, and they stood together, his arm still encircling her. Tess's eyes, fixed on distance, began to fill. "Why do you cry, my darling?" he said. "Oh, I don't know," she murmured regretfully. As she saw and felt more clearly the position she was in, she became agitated, looked askance, and tried to withdraw. "Well, I have betrayed my feeling, Tess, at last," said he, with a curious sigh of desperation, signifying, unconsciously, that his heart had outrun his judgment. "That I love you dearly, and truly, I need not say. But it shall go no farther now. It distresses you. I am as surprised as you are. You'll not think I have presumed upon your defencelessness, been too quick and unreflecting, will you? I cannot tell." He had allowed her to free herself, and in a minute or two the milking of each was resumed. Nobody had beheld the gravitation of the two into one, and when the dairyman came round by that screened nook a few minutes later, there was not a sign to reveal that the markedly sundered pair were more to each other than mere acquaintances. Yet, in the interval since Crick's last view of them, something had occurred which changed the pivot of the universe for their two natures. Whilst it should last, something which, had he known its quality, the dairyman would have despised as a practical man, yet which was based upon a more stubborn and resistless tendency than a whole heap of so-called practicalities. A veil had been whisked aside,